Hi, everyone. Welcome to the January 9th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski as we do really the first proper Pacecast of 2024. Last week, we spent the bulk of the Pacecast looking back at 2023, discussing our Eclipse Award ballots. Some people have an appetite for that discussion. Some don't. I get it. Some don't care about the Eclipse Awards. But this week, we're moving on and we're looking ahead to what's to come this year. And I think a lot of the performances that we're talking about in the respective divisions really do get you excited for what might be on the horizon in 2024, especially among the 3-year-olds. We saw some impressive performances in some very early Derby preps, both out in California and at Aqueduct. We saw some 3-year-old turf horses in action at Gulfstream Park, some efforts on synthetic that we'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast. But I think there's definitely some talent out there, Craig, and it's going to be interesting to see how these horses all develop heading into the more competitive portion of the season.
Yeah, it's always a little interesting to start the year. We saw plenty of good 2-year-old performances. You never really know how it's going to translate, but I think we got off to a good start this past weekend and looking forward to lots more big races coming up. And as we talked about a little bit last week, they're going to come at us hot and heavy. The schedule really doesn't let up now for quite a while.
Well, let's kick things off this week by talking about Santa Anita. That's, of course, where we focused our attention on the forecast last week. We handicapped the late pick 5 sequence there, and we'll talk about, I think, 3 races from that sequence. Craig and I, we did pretty well. I think the first leg kind of got us off to an annoying start because a horse that we overlooked at a big price one. We'll talk about that when we get there because we are going to mention that race. But I think we were mostly right the rest of the way, Craig. Let's start off by talking about the feature race on Saturday. That was the Grade 2 San Vicente. And no surprise about the result here. Muth went off as the heavy favorite and delivered. I wouldn't say that he necessarily gained anything with this victory. I mean, he did what he was supposed to do. I'd call it a workman-like effort. It wasn't overly impressive, but it was certainly not a bad way to start off this 3-year-old season.
I think workman-like is a great explanation of that effort. As a speed figure guy, I wasn't sure what to make of it. I know when I sent you the rundown, I usually try to give an estimate if I have one for the figure. I didn't even try because I just wanted to see what my assistant would come up with. Luckily, he sent them in this morning, Tuesday morning. He gave Muth a 107. He broke that out from the other sprints, and I totally get why he did it, because if he didn't, that race was going to come up really, really slow. When you compare it to all the other dirt races on the card, he was pretty conservative. I would say it wasn't the biggest breakout he could have done. It could have been a higher number, but it was just a really tough one to come up with, given that the horses in the field were lightly raced. Muth, it's just hard to judge how fully cranked up he was for that one. So I'm fine with the number he gave. It's one that we gave the breakout notation, and I'll certainly be keeping an eye out going forward because it's one, honestly, I think maybe it'll turn out to be a better race. Maybe it could turn out to actually be as slow as it looked on the clock. So one I'm not going to have a whole lot of faith in until we see some runbacks.
Yeah, it's always tough on these days when there are just 4 dirt races, and I think all of them were around 1 turn, so that helps a little bit, but still, there's turf races in between each of them, so you can't really be sure if the track has changed or not. I mean, what I will say about the San Vicente, Craig, is a lower number makes sense for basically everybody else in this field. You just have to kind of decide that Muth took a slight step backwards, which I think would be reasonable. He's definitely not cranked up to deliver his best performance going 7 furlongs in January. I think that they've got bigger targets on the horizon later for this very expensive horse who had such a strong 2-year-old campaign. So I think we'll likely see better out of him in the future. Did what he was supposed to do in this race. I'll note he was pretty aggressive in the early stages here. You kind of had 5 horses vying for the early lead, and he was sort of right in the middle of them. Juan Hernandez actually had to give him a big tug back on the reins halfway down the backstretch to make sure that he wasn't doing too much in the early stages of this race. But at the end of the day, he was just superior to the rivals that he was meeting here. And I think we'll talk about particularly the speed figures assigned to the 2 Derby preps, Craig, because we get to Aqueduct a little bit later, because I think both of those were a little subjective. and you and Bayer made different decisions in both races, so you're going to see a wide disparity between those two numbers, and I think we can talk about it when we get there. As you were kind of alluding to, it looked like Bayer gave this race an even bigger upgrade, the San Vicente, which I think you just said you understand. It's hard to be sure, just given how lightly raced these horses are.
Yeah, no doubt. I wouldn't argue with the figure anyone gave. It's one that I just think you have to keep an eye on going forward. Like you mentioned, there were turf races on both sides of this one, so it's impossible to say really what was done with the track in between. And maybe it was nothing, and maybe the race is a lot slower than what we even gave it, which is still what I would consider pretty low based on what we'd seen from Muth before. So just kind of shows making speed figures, it isn't always easy. Sometimes there is some art involved, and we're even going to talk about that a little more as we move on to the Santa Ynez.
Yeah, let's talk about that race next. Now, this was on Sunday's card at Santa Anita, whereas the San Vicente was on Saturday, but same conditions, just the 3-year-old fillies in action instead of the males going the 7 furlong distance. And looks like a promising filly here with Copion, who was an impressive winner of her debut and then arguably won this Santa Ynez even easier than she did her maiden race first time out, just never really challenged at any point. But the pace of this race, Craig, was really in her favor. I mean, nobody else in this field ever issued a challenge to her.
No, not at all. This almost looked like a paid workout when you watch it, and the pace figures reflect it as well. I'm not sure, it's not in the chart yet if it'll get the blue fractions, but it's one where the race just kept getting faster, about 7 points faster at every call. So if it's not, I would still consider it a moderate pace. It's one that the winner gets a downgrade a little bit. I'm estimating it'll be about a 101 TimeformUS speed figure. The final time figure will be in the 104 range. So obviously this is a very talented filly. I just think we have to see when she actually gets tested, because we haven't really seen that yet.
Yeah, and obviously her stablemate, who goes out for Spendthrift Farm, and Richard Mandela, Tamra, was gone to the sidelines. But this filly going out for the same connections looks like she's started off her career in a very similar fashion to that one, winning a maiden race and then beating stakes rivals so easily. We'll see if stretching out is ultimately what she wants to do. I think she certainly gave the impression in this victory that a little added distance is not going to be a problem, provided that she gets to control the pace the way that she did in this race. She definitely's got pedigree to go longer. She's a half sister to a couple of talented runners that ran up in Canada, Amise Gizmo, who I believe placed in the Queen's Plate, and Amise Flatter, who was a capable dirt router, also one going sprint distances. So definitely a lot of versatility here. So we'll be interested to see how this one develops when she inevitably faces some tougher competition in the future. Let's go back to Saturday's card, Craig, when they ran that San Vicente. And I think we should talk about that other sprint race that was run as part of the Pick 5 sequence, because it also had some high quality runners on the dirt. That was an allowance race that went as the 6th on the card, won by Big City Lights. And I thought that this horse put in a good effort. He finally got away from his arch nemesis, that horse that's continually beating him in Southern California. Craig, remind me of his name. The Chosen Brawn. That's right. It was on the tip of my tongue. I think he had been beaten by that horse 4 times in a row, finishing second in all of those races. Dropped out of stakes company here. Still met a pretty salty field, even though it was a short field, and was able to beat a couple of talented rivals, including Newgate, who made his return from the layoff, and I thought ran pretty well to be second.
Yeah, I did as well. I mean, Big City Lights got a nice trip, was game to the wire, as he always is. He just, for whatever reason, he's just not good enough at this point to beat the Chosen Varan, but he always runs well. He beat everybody else he's ever faced, I believe, and he did so again here. As for Newgate, I thought he ran well. He was drawing the inside, I don't think was ideal for him. It wasn't the greatest trip. He was in behind, taking some dirt. The pace, I don't think it was solid. It won't be red fractions by any means, but I thought he ran well off of over a 6-month layoff. So the top two are both going to be seen in stakes races in Southern California.
Yeah, I think we already know Big City Lights is a graded stakes quality horse, even if he hasn't achieved that kind of success yet. And as long as he's able to stay in consistent training, because he's had some significant layoffs during his career, then I think he's going to be a factor in that sprint division out west. Newgate, Craig, I wouldn't be surprised if they stretch him out off this. I know Bob Baffert kind of alluded to that coming into this race, that this is just a tightener. They're probably going to want to go longer with him. And he ran well. I think he, at the very least, showed that speed figure that he earned when he won that Robert B. Lewis last year was no fluke. I mean, he basically got back to that number in this race, and now he's likely to move forward, probably going a little bit longer in the future. So wouldn't be surprised if there's better yet to come from him.
Yeah, and I think I forgot to mention the speed figure for the winner was a 119. So particularly in Southern California, that's a good solid stake speed figure, graded stakes type.
And the third place finisher, Sir Atticus, ran a somewhat unexpected race. I mean, I think we both expected him to be part of the pace, especially breaking inside of all that speed, but he just didn't really seem to have it in the early stage of this race. I mean, it's not like Mike Smith is the kind of rider that's ever going to be overly aggressive, hustling a horse out of the gate. But this guy just seemed content to drop to the back of the pack and used a completely different running style than we had seen from him in the past, making a big closing run to get up for third. He ran okay, all things considered, compared to his prior form. Just an unusual effort from him.
Yeah, I didn't get that at all. Maybe it was the horse. It's hard to say from the inside post. I thought he would go, but sometimes the horses don't always cooperate with your strategy. It looked to me like he was just slow to get going.
And one more race we'll talk about from Saturday's card. It was the race that began that late pick 5 sequence that we handicapped on the forecast last week. And unfortunately, Craig, we couldn't land on the $38 winner, Nesso's Last Hurrah. I don't even think we mentioned him in our analysis. We mentioned so many horses, but that's the way it goes sometimes. The turn back on the turf proved to be key for this horse because he had run twice on the turf and had put forth an okay effort first time on it, going longer, but he had run some nice sprint races on dirt early in his career, and just turning back to the shorter distance really seemed to do the trick for him. And he was the one that got to the lead in a race where I think we both acknowledged the horse that got to the front might be dangerous.
And he was. I mean, he was never challenged at any point once he got there. It was a good aggressive ride by Barrios, getting him to the front from that outside post. And not only was it good, I mean, he ran a good speed figure. That's why we're talking about it. He jumped all the way up to 106. Don't know how much of it was the turn back. Maybe some of it was first time Lasix. Maybe that worked for him as a newly turned 3-year-old, but it was an impressive number. He's the kind of horse I would generally have liked that it's been 6.5 down the hill, but I kind of overlooked him turning all the way back to 6 furlongs. And that proved to be a mistake because he just looked like a different horse than what we had seen from him the first couple times.
Yeah, it was one of those situations where so many horses appeared to have upside in this race that seemed like a number of lightly raced runners that were going to take a step forward. And he had just had more chances than others. And I think we both kind of overlooked him on that fact because his race 2 back definitely made him a contender in here. It was just whether or not he could do it going 6 furlongs. Well, we can stop redboarding that one. Neither of us were on him on when it really counted, but he definitely put forth a good effort to win. Felt like the pace might have been in his favor, Craig. I haven't yet seen the pace figures for this race, but just looking at the raw fractions and kind of knowing how these flat turf sprints play at Santa Anita when speed is traditionally dangerous in those races, he was able to get away with some pretty comfortable fractions.
Yeah, comfortable. It won't be blue or anything. It was just kind of even throughout, even slowed down a little late, but as you said, that's a dangerous trip to let someone get away with. Unless the fractions get up in the red territory, which they didn't, speed is always going to be dangerous.
Let's move on to South Florida and talk about some stakes action from Gulfstream Park on Saturday. We both mentioned the Limehouse. We did stakes previews of all of these races on the YouTube channel, Craig, and I think the main story of these races were scratches because a lot of quality came out of all 3 of these stakes races. We're not even going to talk about the Limehouse because I think the 2 horses that would have taken all the money in there came out, and a horse that I was expecting to get $20 on ended up paying $560. Who knows if he would have won if the others were in there, but he did run pretty well. That was shipped to shore. But we're going to focus on the 2 turf races. The Ginger Brew was the one that was probably the least affected by scratches because the main players pretty much stayed in this race. I will say, though, this was really a tale of different trips, as Tyler Gaffalione could not have worked out a better journey for the winner, Ozara.
No, that was a very nice ride by Tyler Gaffleone. And honestly, this is a horse I picked. I kind of expected a good trip with the inside. And we had mentioned a few of the others had tough draws in here. And Life's Inaudible, I thought, ran very well to get up to be second. I kind of confirmed that form we had seen from her in the fall in the Miss Griot at Aqueduct. So good effort from the top two. Little disappointing was the third horse, Waskasu, I think is how you say that. She wound up taking a lot of money going off the morning line favorite off an eight, or going off the favorite off an 8-1 morning line. Not surprised she got bet down, but I was really surprised she got bet down as much as she did. So she just still has some promise, I think. But the top two are legitimate. They're good, solid 3-year-old fillies on the turf.
Yeah, we handicapped this race before we saw the morning lines, and I think when you see an 8-1 morning line and a horse like Waskasu, who seems like such an obvious contender, those types just seem to get bet down more than they really deserve to. It's like that snowball effect where everyone feels like, "Ooh, I landed on an 8-1 shot," and then once that horse starts to get some steam, it's like, "Oh, my 8-1 shot's live, so I've got to stick with it now." And I think you just end up getting more people on that horse than otherwise would be the case. But when I was talking about different trips, I was kind of referring to Waskasu, Craig, because I don't know if she was going to win this race, but it really was not the right kind of journey. I mean, she got turned sideways at the start, put further back in the pack than I think she really wanted to or needed to be. And then from there, Junior Alvarado tried to continually move her up, racing outside, but she really never had any cover, was always in the 3-4 path. And when you're racing against a horse like Ozara, who was able to save ground right in the rail every step of the way, it's pretty tough to get up and win in that situation. So I'm not going to hold her performance against her too much, although it was a nice try first time against winners. The horse that was probably also affected by post position was the runner-up, Life's Inaudible, but we kind of saw that coming into the race, Craig. It was a tough post, and she's a horse that doesn't have a whole lot of early speed and was just motoring too late.
Yeah, she was just done in by the draw. I mean, it was kind of obvious, especially at Gulfstream. It's just a turf course, which is not very friendly to those outside posts. The winner got a 104 speed figure. I don't want to overlook that because when we talk about the next race, it's going to be the speed figures are going to be similar, but the times were quite different. And the reason is because of the pace. This was a race with a really solid pace up in front of Ozara. Two horses were going pretty quick. Not sure if they're going to be in red, but it was a really good pace. She was able to find a way out. But even though I picked Ozara on top and I did actually better, I wouldn't argue with anyone that would say she was the third best horse in the race, but that's just how it works out in turf sometimes. And you need to handicap for that at times because, trips are really important in these spots.
Yeah, I don't want to go so far as to say she was third best. I mean, she did win by 2.25 lengths at the end of the day, and that's significant on the turf. But she's definitely a horse that has been improving in recent starts for Christophe Clement. But as you were just teeing up, Craig, the other stakes run going the same distance, a mile on the turf at Gulfstream, and I think not the situation that we would sometimes encounter where there were different rail settings. I think both of these races were run at 45 feet on that new turf course, just wildly different pace situations. And I think this one was largely a product of some really key scratches in this race. I mean, Craig, this turned out to be a completely different race than we handicapped on, what was it, Thursday? I mean, 4 major players came out. The pace situation completely changed. And I don't know if I was going to upgrade to Kaio to win the race, but I mean, he just ended up in a situation where he was the lone speed in here, and nobody came out of their typical running style to challenge him. They just let him get away with ridiculously slow fractions, and it turned into a sprint to the wire.
Yeah, it was an interesting race, as you say. You had to totally re-handicap. I wound up passing this one. I gave Takayo a look, but just didn't think he was good enough. But on that Gulfstream turf course, when you let horses go as slow early as he did, a 50 going a mile is just kind of silly. And he was able to hold on and get the win. We wound up giving him a pace adjusted 101 TimeformUS speed figure. I haven't checked the ones in behind to see if they actually got better numbers, which is often the case in these slow pace races. But this is a race I'm just going to take with a grain of salt. I'm not sure the figures really mean much. It was just one that lost all its appeal once the scratches happened.
Yeah, I mean, I guess not so much for the backers of Takayo, who got nearly
Right.
$30 to win on him. What I will say about the winner, Craig, is he was involved in a pace in the pulpit in his start just prior to this that completely fell apart. I think we talked about it on our preview that the top three finishers in that race came from last, second to last, and third to last, and he was the one that was contesting the pace that day. So there was a case to be made for him. Would we have made the case if this race had come up the way that it ultimately left the starting gate as opposed to the way it was drawn? I don't really know. I didn't really handicap it, but definitely a horse whose chances were elevated by scratches in this race. What do you make of Agate Road, who was second in here? Yes, he was against that unfavorable pace scenario, but I still thought he was a little dull through the stretch of this race.
I did too. I thought he had every chance. He was obviously the horse that got helped a lot by the scratches because he had drawn far outside, just like his stablemate. But moving all the way into the sixth post, I don't think it was really an issue. Had a decent trip and just couldn't out finish or even make much of a dent into Kaio's lead. So, yeah, I'm a little leery. I didn't like what I saw from him in the Breeders' Cup juvenile turf. I didn't think, even though, I mean, you could make some excuses for him that day, but he just looked a little flat. And I saw the same thing here. So he's a horse that I think might actually get a little overrated coming off of this one.
Yeah, I could see him take money again next time, and it just feels like this might have been a weaker race overall. I mean, the speed figure reflects that, though. I mean, I think it's hard to make a speed figure for this race. I don't know if we mentioned it. I think you gave this race a 102 TimeformUS speed figure compared to 104 for Ozara. But when you've got such a significant pace upgrade in a situation like this, it's hard to be exactly sure of how these two races fit together.
Right, for sure. It's two races that were basically rated completely differently. This one gets the pace notation. I'm sure when you look in the Timeform US charts, you'll see a much, much lower final time figure for this race. And that's one of the good options I think we have at Timeform US is that we can use that pace designation and show you how fast the race really was final time wise. And if you choose not to use the overall rating, that's fine.
Let's move on to Aqueduct, and we're going to talk about another very early Kentucky Derby prep. This one actually offers some points towards the Kentucky Derby as opposed to the San Vicente, which did not. The Jerome Stakes, traditional first prep on the New York road to the Kentucky Derby for the three-year-olds. This one going the 1 mile distance around one turn, and heavy favorite drumroll please got the job done here. Another race, Craig, where I feel like it was probably difficult to really peg down this speed figure because the track at Aqueduct definitely was going through some changes on Saturday. That's something we often see in the wintertime when the temperatures are cold. And I think they were expecting rain on Saturday as well. So they probably altered their track maintenance a little bit. And it just seemed like a really slow, dead surface at the start of the day. And you could kind of tell it watching this race is there were some big gaps between the runners at the wire, a few just struggling to even get to the finish line in this race to complete it. Not the case for Drumroll Please, who feels like one that, if anything, a mile is on the short side for him. He just seems like the kind of horse that is just going to gallop at one pace and run all day. And I think at the end of the day, that's what allowed him to get the victory over El Grandeo, who is a nice horse, but just seemed to be exposed a little bit by the distance over a very demanding surface.
It was very demanding. I think I'm looking at the chart now. We have this race a 2 on the track condition scale, which goes from 1 to 10. So it's about as slow as you're going to find. Now, it did change a little throughout the day, in my opinion, which isn't unusual for Aqueduct this time of year. It can be very tricky. I've talked about it many times. I like to think I have a very good handle on the Aqueduct track. I really take my time with these figures and go through it. And it was a case where not only do I think the track got faster throughout the day, it also is one where the very shorter sprint races, the 6 furlong races, were faster for whatever reason than the longer races at 7 furlongs and a mile. So that played into my figure as well. Drum roll, please, wound up with a 114, El Grande O a 112. And it's like, look at the chart. I mean, all the figures kind of make sense for the horses. So it's one I'll keep an eye on, but it's also just one on the tricky Aqueduct surface that I know you I haven't seen what the buyer is. Apparently it's quite different, but it's one of those where that's what's going to happen. No matter who makes the speed figures, you're going to see more variance than you usually would.
It's one of those situations where the speed figures become more subjective than I think you would really prefer them to be. And when you've got two different speed figure makers, both highly respected figure makers, you and Buyer, or I should say the Buyer team and your guy, your team, I know you make the speed figure personally, but if you make two different decisions on two different races, you can have a wild swing. And I think Buyer had the San Vicente 11 points faster than the Withers. The Jerome, and you had the Jerome 7 points faster than the San Vicente. So that's a 18-point swing between those two races. But as I just said, two different decisions can come up with two different numbers. And ideally, it wouldn't have to be that way. Ideally, these days would be easy. The tracks wouldn't be changing. But it can be tough, especially when these horses are so lightly raced, deciding exactly when the track changed, which horses ran faster, which ran slower. And looking at each of the numbers, Craig, I mean, I can believe it either way. I see the case. Drum roll, please. I mean, we had talked about it. He, in the Remsen, had run so much better than the result might indicate, just given the fact that he was against the racetrack, had made a wide move into the pace, making an earlier move than the eventual runner-up, Sierra Leone. So that was a really good effort from him. Definitely a horse that's improving. We'd already seen some big efforts out of El Grandeo, so I can certainly understand the high speed figure for them. If you look at the Buyer number, it kind of you have to decide that every single horse in the race regressed, significantly. So I get it either way, but it's definitely not easy.
No, it's not. And I mean, I got some of that horse player in me. I'm confident. I'm confident in these numbers. So we'll see going forward. It doesn't mean I'm not open to change, but I would expect these horses to run back. I don't see any way somebody could watch the drum roll, please, to last two races and think he would run a lower speed figure. I mean, I thought he was very good on Saturday, and he's a horse I look forward to going forward. The one caveat would be that I'm always a little leery of these Aqueduct races over these winter bogs because they're just so different than all the other racetracks we're going to see as we move forward. And the way it's turned out, most horses that I've seen don't really transfer that form.
Yeah, and I should mention on this Aqueduct Saturday, I mean, one of the difficulties is there were two 1 mile races back to back, races 3 and race 4, with the Jerome being race 3. And a maiden race, race 4, did get a faster time than the Jerome. But I know that you made the decision that the track had to have changed between those two races. And, deciding when you think that change happened is critical to what the speed figure is going to be. But based on the performances of the horses coming into these respective races, I kind of side with you on that one, Craig, and we'll see how these horses ultimately do in the future. Obviously, both of these races are just preps. I mean, they're stepping stones for these horses, so they're all likely to do better at some point down the line. And I really do think, drumroll please, and I've made no illusions about the fact that I'm a fan of this horse, but I really think that more distance is going to be his friend. I mean, just watching the gallop out of this race after the wire, I mean, he continued to run into that clubhouse turn with vigor, and everybody else, including the runner-up, just basically came to a stop. So it feels like the demanding surface really suited him, and it sounds like Brad Cox said they're going to point to the Withers, which is that 1.125 test in February for his next start. So sounds like he's going to take that New York road to the Derby.
Yeah, it seems like a perfectly logical step. As you said, seems like more distance, the better for him.
Let's talk about the other stakes they ran at Aqueduct on Saturday. That was the ladies. Now, this was much later in the day after it looked like the track had sped up a little bit, but not considerably so, because this race still had a pretty slow, raw final time that probably is not as slow as it actually seems, just based on how dead the track was at Aqueduct on Saturday. But another Brad Cox trained winner with Comparative just getting the decision over Saddle Up Jesse. These two put on a nice show to the wire. It looked like Saddle Up Jesse had that winner measured coming to the finish line, but Comparative was pretty game to battle back on the inside.
Yeah, very game. Wound up with a 110 speed figure, another forward progression for this one. Not ready to move into graded stakes company by any means, but I just thought this was a good, interesting betting race. 6 horses, you had 4 of them between 2-1 and 4-1, and I thought Comparative ran very well. She dueled with Chismo Bubbly early on. and that one was a contender in here, was only 4-1, was coming off a nice win. I was able to put her away. And I just really like when I see that gameness, particularly when a horse does it like she did on the inside. That's something a lot of horses won't do. So I think this horse might be even a little better than the 110 speed figure we assigned. This was the only 2-turn race on the day, so it's not always the easiest speed figure, but at Aqueduct, it's not too tough. It's pretty good handle on how they line up with the sprints most days, and the horses in here all had pretty good form coming in.
Yeah, I like that we're still riding the ladies. It's one of the oldest stakes races in this country. Not as important as it once was. I think at one point in time it was a grade 1 race, but this one still drew a competitive field and feels like there's at least a little bit of promise between the first two finishers. Comparative is just a 4-year-old, so she's obviously only hitting her peak at around this point in her career. She had run some decent races as a 3-year-old, but is now capable of producing faster performances since returning from that layoff this winter, and definitely a step in the right direction off her return in her prior start. So I don't know if this one's done improving. I think we could continue to see more out of her in the future. But like you were saying, these horses are going to have to get a little bit faster to compete against the best in this division. How much faster, I think it remains to be seen, because as we witnessed in the Breeders' Cup Distaff, Craig, even though the winner of the race is a really likable horse, I don't know if Idiomatic is staying in training. I haven't seen reporting on that yet. And I think a few horses coming out of last year's filly and mare division and the 3-year-old filly division haven't run the fastest speed figures, or maybe weren't at their best form last year. So, or I should say when the season ended. So remains to be seen how tough this filly and mare division is going to be on the dirt in 2024.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, the reason I even included this race, I mean, it's not a graded race, is because she is a newly turned 4-year-old. And I do think there's some room for her to keep progressing. Not just that she's newly turned, she's pretty lightly raced as well.
Well, Craig, next up, let's talk about the race that got a lot of people talking on Sunday. An unusual set of circumstances behind the victory of Crimson Light, who was a 3-year-old first-time starter who won a New York-bred maiden special weight over that wet track at Aqueduct on Sunday. And typically, we're not going to talk about a horse that gets a TimeformUS speed figure of 71. I think the last time we talked about a horse that got a speed figure this low was probably when another Todd Pletcher horse, Julia Shining, made her debut in somewhat similar circumstances at Keeneland, a race that a lot of people felt was so much better than the final time or the bare result. And you could definitely say that about this horse, Crimson Light, based on the kind of start that he had.
Yeah, this was quite the wild one. I mean, this horse nearly went over what I think is a temporary rail at that point in the chute. Very athletic by Kendrick Carmouche to do what he did. And I don't even know how he stayed on the horse. It was impressive. The horse basically had to stop and start running again. I don't think I'm speaking too far out of turn if I say this horse was cost 20 lengths at the start. I think if somebody wanted to tell me it was more, I might not argue too much, because he just had to totally restart. Eventually got going, and once he did, I mean, he showed some real talent. He kept running. He was wide. You could argue it was good to be wide on this course, but still, to overcome the trouble he did at the start, you just don't see this very often. The speed figure is pretty irrelevant for this horse. I'm not saying he's going to turn out to be some stakes winner. You just don't know. But these kind of races are just fun to watch. Maybe not fun if you bet on the 7 in this particular spot at 18-1. And then he had to withstand an objection, I believe. But having watched it, I think it was the right call. It didn't seem like Crimson Light. If anything, it was a 50-50. If not more, the 7 caused more problems than the 1. So I'm fine with it staying up as is. And just probably the last time we'll talk about a speed figure of 71 for a long time. But I think it was worthy of discussion, because you just don't see races like this very often.
Yeah, it is one of those you have to see it to believe it races, because we see a lot of horses very green on debut, have starts like that, and very rarely do they actually get up to win their races. Now, the reason this horse is getting so much attention is because he did get to the wire first. And the reason he got to the wire first was because he was facing a subpar group of New York breds. I mean, he got such a low speed figure because as a winner, because everybody else led him. I mean, there was nobody else in this race that could run a faster number, and there was plenty of pace signed on, and he was never going to get there if the race didn't completely fall apart the way that it did. The horse that was second to last in the early stages, so it was one of those races where the whole field sort of came together at the end. And the reality of this horse, Craig, is that typically in this situation, we'd be talking about this horse as an interesting horse that you might want to bet back next time after finishing third or fourth in a maiden race, because typically these horses aren't able to win when they're competing against more legitimate competition. And if this horse had been in a solid open company race, or even competing in a maiden race that was run later this day that I think got a speed figure that was some 20 or 25 points higher, he probably would have been fifth or sixth in that race. And we'd be talking about, oh, this is a horse that made up 20 lengths, that went from 30 lengths back to lose by 8 or 10. And this is one maybe you want to bet next time at a decent price. But the fact that he won has gotten a lot more eyes on the race and a lot more eyes on this horse. And I think he's one that a lot of people will be looking forward to see where he shows up next time and how good he's going to turn out to be. I mean, I had people responding to some of my tweets about him, calling him the Kentucky Derby winner. And I think that, a lot of racing fans that aren't used to seeing a horse win under those circumstances can get a little carried away in that situation. And as you were saying, it's hard to quantify how much faster this horse could have run. I put up a screenshot of the GMAX data for this race, and I mean, what we can say is that, GMAX puts out the times by 16th for these horses. And it's just a fact that this horse ran his first 16th, the one that included all that trouble where he basically came to a stop. He ran that first 16th between 1.6 and 2.2 seconds slower than the rest of the field. I mean, when you equate that to time, I was kind of doing a speed figure conversion. That's a good 20 to 28 points. I mean, I was talking about the buyer numbers, but I mean, the TimeformUS conversion would be very, very, very similar. 20 to 28 points of lost speed figure that horse could have achieved. Now, I don't think you can just add that to the speed figure he got and say that's how fast or how good this horse is, because that's ignoring a lot of other variables. I mean, the fact that the pace collapsed, which helped him, the fact that he actually did hit the rail, which could have caused psychological or physical stress to the horse. So, I mean, a lot that you have to consider with a performance like this, and just one that's going to be really tough to peg the next time that he runs back. I think something we can safely assume is that he probably is going to be overbet.
Yeah, he will be, but he has some talent. So, I mean, it's almost to the point where I think you mentioned somebody saying the Kentucky Derby, and obviously that's a bit silly. But I've seen people go in the other direction as well, where they're just totally dismissing this horse, saying, oh, he's never going to win another race. Well, I would bet anything he's going to win another race because he's a New York bred, and the competition won't be as steep. And I think he showed some real talent. He was even money in here. As you said, the field was weak, but it wasn't just that. He must have shown something along the way. So I don't want to totally write him off as a horse. Yeah, I'm not going to be betting him because he will almost assuredly get overbet for at least a few races. And if he wins again, it's only going to snowball. But I don't just want to totally dismiss him as a fluke, because I do think he showed some real ability.
Yeah, and what we don't know is what his true running style is. I mean, I don't think you can base that fact. You can say he's a deep closer based on this race because, I mean, he was just, completely discombobulated at the start. And I mean, typically when horses hit the rail, it's not indicative of the fact that they're a closer. It just means that they were really green. If, they figure it out next time and he doesn't draw the inside and is able to break it professionally, he might be a speed horse. Who knows? I think we'll learn a lot more about him in his next start. Move on to Turfway Park, and we'll talk about some synthetic racing, a lot more all-weather racing than we usually talk about on this podcast, Greg, because there were some good performances at Turfway last week, including their feature race on Saturday, the Turfway Preview, very early season 3-year-old race for some sophomores that could ultimately be prepping for a race like the Jeff Ruby Stakes later on. We'll see if Vote No, the winner of this race, turns out to be that kind of horse, but I would say he's got some credentials. I mean, he ran pretty well going longer on the turf last year. He was obviously turning back in this race, but was able to take another step forward, getting back to the synthetic.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's kind of odd talking about Turfway because very rarely have we talked about it in the past. But the way the purses are at that track now, I don't think it's going to be any big surprise if we're going to see just more and more good horses trying the synthetic and giving it a shot for the money. And I think it's going to be a variable that maybe we're not used to dealing with, because in the past it's been easy to just kind of dismiss these horses and assume they wouldn't handle dirt. But and maybe it'll continue that way, but it's one that I think is going to open up some new lines for handicapping. And vote no, maybe he'll be one of these because he ran a very good speed figure on Saturday. I believe he wound up with a 107 Timeform US number. I didn't have the official figure when I made this, but yeah, he's a horse who, I mean, he just blew this field away. Moving from turf to the synthetic. He's now won both of his synthetic starts, 3 out of 4 overall. So he's a horse with some promise. I imagine he'll stay on that trail that they have. Maybe the Battaglia is next before you move on to the bigger points race. But yeah, he has some ability, and it's just going to be tricky evaluating these horses as they move on the Derby trail.
Yeah, I mean, he got a pretty confident ride in this race, was content to drop back to almost last early. But once they got him to the outside around the far turn, he made a big sweeping move to take the lead, but an upper stretch, and then draw away pretty emphatically at the end. Not really sure what was behind him in here. I mean, one horse had run a big speed figure before, but didn't necessarily repeat that performance in this spot. So I think we'll learn more about him when he stretches out on the synthetic next time. I think the next race in this series is the 1 mile distance. So I would imagine he's not going to have trouble with the stretch out because he went longer as a 2-year-old, but definitely a horse that might still have some upside and took a step forward here. Another race on the synthetic from last week at Turfway was a Friday allowance race. I think the feature race on that Friday card, won by the returning Fantastic again, and kind of a horse that we had talked about in Vote No's position a year ago. He had won a stakes at Gulfstream, sort of on that at Turfway, I should say, on that Jeff Ruby trail. Ultimately got to the Jeff Ruby Stakes and ran okay behind 2 fills. That turned out to be one of the faster Derby preps. Had settled for third that day, tried turf, and then went to the sidelines, but got back to his preferred synthetic surface here off the layoff, and definitely seems like a horse that's taken a step forward as a 4-year-old.
Yeah, no doubt. Certainly did speed figure wise, getting a 124 for his win on Friday night. While we were talking, I looked up Vote No. He wound up with a 108. But yeah, this was a very big effort from him. There were plenty of routes run at Turfway, so it's not like these are tough figures to make because you don't have a lot of data. Now, Turfway can be tricky. It's a synthetic track, obviously, and can have some pretty wild variants, but we stuck with rating the races together on this day. And I think it was a really good effort from him. I would imagine he's a horse who is going to go back to turf. Not sure he's a dirt horse. He did break his maiden in and off the turf race, but his next try at Keeneland was pretty ugly. So I would imagine they would want to keep him on synthetic or turf, but he certainly has some ability on those 2 surfaces.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a good point in the winter to be hitting this kind of form because there are a lot of stakes through the winter at Turfway, as you said. The purses have been stronger than in the past, and he's a horse that seems like he could have plenty more synthetic races on his agenda in the next few months as long as he's able to stay sound. So nice performance from him to get that 124 Timeform US speed figure. Also, shout out to the runner-up Surly Furious, who is just a horse that I feel like we're constantly mentioning either on this show or the forecast. He just runs often. It doesn't matter the surface. He's trying hard, and big effort for him to make that big rush from last into second this day, though he was never a threat for the winner.
No, he wasn't. But like you said, it's not like speed fell apart in this race. The 3 early leaders finished in the top 5, so he's just a good game horse.
One more race that we should mention from this Friday card at Turfway is a maiden special weight event that went as race 5 right in the middle of this card, won by the second-time starter for trainer Joe Ennis, Epic Ride. And this was a really solid effort from this horse. I mean, ran well in his debut, took a big step forward here, showing good speed to get to the front, dueled with the eventual runner-up, put that horse away, and opened up a nice march into the wire.
Yeah, it was, and that's his maiden race where he finished second with an 85 is one that's proven to be pretty strong. He came out with a 112. The horse who finished fourth, a horse named Joe Shiesty, actually came back to win with a 114 speed figure, and has and ran again since then. Ran a good third in that stake to vote no that we already talked about. So maybe that maiden race is a little underrated and one to keep an eye out as a potential key race. But yeah, he's shown some real ability. He's out of blame, Gio Ponte, so it seems a little bit murky as to what he would prefer, if he would be more of a turf or a dirt horse, but he certainly has some ability.
Yeah, and apologies to John Ennis. I think I used your wrong first name there, but got a nice horse with Epic Ride. That 112 Timeform US speed figure for this performance, that's really strong for a 3-year-old maiden breaker. And I think the 116 final time number even higher. So real quality displayed by this horse. The one thing I'll note about watching this race, Craig, is that he never changed leads. He did hang on his left lead all through the stretch, and despite that, was actually getting out through the stretch, something you don't often see. Usually horses that hang on their left lead are lugging in, but he was sort of drifting out to the wire a little bit. So something you might want to just keep in mind about this horse moving forward. But still, this one showed talent. And as you said, it's going to be interesting to see what he ultimately wants to do moving forward, because it's a versatile pedigree. I mean, you definitely get that versatility from Blame. And on the Dam side, the Dam is a half sister to 3 horses that were all different. Mr. Karis, who was a turf router, 7 furlong type, who could run in stakes races, up the ante, who was a similar type, and then Aristocratic, who was a pure dirt sprinter. So the Dam is by Gio Ponte. Maybe that gives a little bit more turf, but definitely a lot of versatility in this pedigree. And let's finish off this week's podcast with one more race, actually another one for the 3-year-olds, and that was an allowance race that took place on Sunday at Fairgrounds. This one won in dominant fashion by Maycox Bay, a Godolphin trainee who was making his second start going long. And Craig, I'm not sure exactly where this improvement came from, other than the fact that this horse is getting Lasix for the first time, which I guess is something you have to consider with these newly turned 3-year-olds who can suddenly use Lasix in these non-stakes events. But I mean, this horse had stretched out in his prior race and hadn't shown any kind of form that compares to this, and hadn't run that well in a stakes race 3 back, but huge improvement here to win this race in decisive fashion.
I'm not sure where this race came from either. I saw our colleague Marcus Hurst mention the race, which makes sense. I mean, he won this race by over 10 lengths, I believe. But I just kind of brushed it aside and was like, I looked at the race, saw it was an off the turf race. But when I looked at the worksheet, when I was putting the rundown together for today, it was pretty obvious this was going to come up a fast race. And I won't have the official figure till tonight, and I'll be sure to put it out there along with the rundown for the whole week. But I'm guessing it's going to be around a 115, which is a serious number for 3-year-olds this early in the season. I mean, that's some real talent, and maybe it was the Lasix, and that could hurt him if he tries to move in the stakes company, but I wouldn't totally write it off for that. This horse just looked like a new horse in this spot, so he's one worth keeping an eye on. As I said, that speed figure's unofficial, but it looks like a pretty easy one to make to me, so I would think it's going to be up there, and I'd be really surprised if he's not pointed to a stakes race next time out off that effort. And even though it's an off the turf race, the horses in behind him were coming out of dirt races. They had run upper 90 Timeform US speed figures, a Brad Cox and a Joe DeSormo horse. Both of them, they were coming out of the same race around 2 turns. The Brad Cox horse, Blown Cover, was the even money favorite in here, and he just blew him away in the stretch. So again, not sure where this one came from, but with 3-year-olds, that can happen. Maybe it was the Lasix, but he's one worth following.
I will say, I mean, he had all the best of it on the front end, unchallenged lead, got away with what I would assume is a pretty moderate pace to slow pace. I haven't seen the pace figures for this race just yet. But I mean, watching the race, you could tell he was comfortable in front every step of the way, actually wanting to do more in the middle stages of the race. And the jockey Ben Curtis was trying to keep a lid on him going around the far turn or into the far turn. And once he let him loose, he easily opened up on this field through the stretch. I don't know how much running was really going on behind him. Like you said, the runner-up had actually finished ahead of Maycox Bay when they met in that November allowance race at Fairgrounds. Completely different result this time. So something has obviously changed in the interim for these two horses. They both got Lasix. Well, I should say Blown Cover got Lasix the prior time. Maycox Bay was just adding it for this race. So as you noted, that could be different when he steps up into stakes company. And also when he steps up into stakes company, he might not get that same easy lead that he got in this race. So could be a different situation, but you need some talent to earn this kind of speed figure as an early season 3-year-old. And he definitely did that. I would understand why they entered him for turf in this race, Craig, because he's got plenty of turf pedigree. The Dam, Halle Bell, was a good turf horse. She's a half-sister to a turf horse that won, I think, over $600,000. Alms, who raced for these same connections, I think was also trained by Mike Stidham. So maybe turf might still be in this horse's future down the line, but definitely reason to try a Derby prep on the dirt after this.
Yeah, I would assume those plans were put on hold. While you were talking, I looked up the pace flow. It was as even a race from start to finish as you'll find. So no blue or red fractions, just a steady pace throughout.
Well, that wraps up the Pacecast this week. And Greg, I haven't yet taken as much of a look as next weekend as I usually do, so I'm not exactly sure what's on tap. I think they've got some California bred races on Saturday at Santa Anita. I'm not exactly sure what the stakes are going to be at Gulfstream, or if there's any cards of interest at Aqueduct. Hopefully the Saturday card this week in New York is better than the one that was assembled last week. But we'll search around the country and try to find the most interesting sequence to talk about in the forecast, as we usually do.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I haven't looked ahead at all. I don't even know what races are coming up this weekend. So I'm always pretty flexible as a speed figure guy. I see even the tracks I don't do, I still go over the worksheets and see what happens. So I'm pretty flexible as far as where I can go. So whatever you pick is fine by me.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there are too many graded stakes on tap this week. As I said, they got those Cal Cup races at Santa Anita. I think the Busanda is the feature at Aqueduct. There's a Sunshine Sprint at Gulfstream, stakes for 3-year-olds sprinting on the dirt at Oaklawn, a couple stakes for 3-year-olds at Tampa. I think we're actually going to do a stakes preview of one or two of those races. So we'll see what ultimately comes up the best sequence to do. And we'll wait till those cards are all drawn a little later in the week to decide. But that's something to look forward to a little bit later in the week. For now, everybody, thanks for listening to this TimeformUS Pacecast. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for listening, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.